And these posters have stayed in many, many people's minds. Preacher Little knew if you show them a picture, they're much more apt to remember what was going on. How did Jimmy Little get this way? Well, I want us to think about that for a little bit, because we're going to see some information that talks about his early life. He was a very strong man. He was a powerful man, and he was a fighter. We're going to hear a story first that's humorous about how he liked to kill chickens for the table. This is his son talking, whose name is John B. Little.
He had a wonderful throwing arm. I know my mother, I've seen him do it, and my mother would want a chicken and walk out in the yard and ask her which chicken she wanted. He'd pick up a little rock, and she would show him the chicken. He would point his left hand the chicken's head and throw the rock. I've never seen him miss.
Preacher Jimmy Little did not miss. He had what they called a dead eye, and he retained it through the rest of his life. He was a scrapper, and he knew how to fight. He had big fists. I think we may have a photograph of him and his second wife that we can show, that will show how wiry his fists were. I don't know if you can tell from looking at that photograph or not, but you can see that they're bony and they're big. And he used those fists to great advantage. And it was those very fists that led him to Jesus. His son, John B. Little, will tell us a story about how they were boxing on the creek bank.
Well, my daddy was a fighter as he was coming up. And back in those days, they called it towing the mark. And they usually fought to the finish. And I understand that he was fighting on the creek bank one Sunday. And there was a church up on the hill. And he injured this man very bad. And after that, him and some of the others went up to the church. And he joined the church that day and gave his heart to God and fought no more.
When Jimmy Little gave his heart to somebody, it stayed, it stuck. But although Jimmy Little became a saved man after that fight on the creek bank, he didn't immediately give up all his old tactics. Let me read you an article that is a photocopy from the Messenger and Intelligencer of Wadesboro, the M&I, from May 26, 1904. Basically what's going on here was two Mormon elders came to Wingate, and Jimmy Little went for them. Let me just read you real quickly. Mr. Little and the elders engaged in conversation, and the subject of polygamy as practiced by the Mormons was sprung. One of the elders said that he had no argument against polygamy, but the Mother of Christ practiced it. The assertion was too much for Mr. Little, and we learned that he told the elder that he could say what he pleased about Jimmy Little, but he had gone too far in slandering that woman, that is Jesus' mother. And with that declaration, he landed a fist on the elder's mouth. And the elder, not being a man of war, turned to flee, and as he did so, Mr. Little kicked him, and also kicked the other elder, and threw a valise, which one of them had left after them, and warned them never to come to Wingate again. And they never did. So the interesting thing about this thing is that Jimmy Little was a man who, during early Christian life, did not mind fighting. It's funny in a way. Well, it was an instance that I want to show with a painting that we had done that we call the Mountain Man. He was down in Starr, North Carolina, preaching. And as he was preaching, he said that anybody that made liquor was so low they'd steal the quarters off a dead man's eyes. The man got up and waited for Jimmy Little till after the service was over, and then attacked him with a big knife, as you can see here. Preacher Little picked up a rock and defended himself so well that the man himself charged Preacher Little with assault. Well, he got away with it, obviously. Nobody could bring a case like that against a preacher, I think, and get away with it. But the man did try. I found that a very interesting story. There's another poster I want to show about liquor steals. Now, Jimmy Little was not afraid of people who made liquor. It did not bother him a bit. And so let's look at this painting, and I'll try to tell you a little bit about some of the things that went on. Jimmy would go to a still, and he did not care who ran the still or anything about it. He would go and meet the people. This one shows a stick in his hand. I don't know him ever to have attacked anybody that did not attack him first, but I do know of instances where he went to get a still, and he came back in his Model T with the still in the front seat and the stiller in the back. And if you know anything about people who make liquor in North Carolina, you know that they don't give over their stills unless something miraculous happens. There was another interesting story about Jimmy Little, too, about he was supposed to have died. He was riding his buggy and headed to Waxhaw, where he was preaching at that particular time. Something happened that spooked the horse, and he was a very good horseman, so I don't know what happened, but something happened, and the horse was spooked, and the buggy was found totally and completely demolished, and the horse had run away someplace. Well, the word got out that preacher Jimmy Little was dead. Some of his friends went to Waxhaw to look for him, and guess what they found? They didn't find him in the church. They didn't find him outside the church. But over in a pond nearby the church where they did the baptizing, there old Jimmy Little stood, baptizing folks. He might have been scratched up a little bit, but it would take much more than that to hurt Jimmy Little. He was not afraid of anything at all. Matter of fact, his daughter told me that he went after Stiller after Stiller after Stiller and looked directly into the gun. If we can see this tape of Jimmy Little's daughter, Maddie Moffitt, she'll tell us this story.
That was the biggest still that they'd had in that part of the country, the way it was told to me. And so he gets out, he starts to the still. They said, "Brother Little, you better get back in that, whatever his transportation was, you better get back in there." He said, "We're going to shoot if you come a step further. Stop." He said, "Fire away, my soul will be in heaven before the smoke dies out."
Preacher Little learned how to read with great difficulty. He left school about the second grade, as best as I can tell, and he never had any formal education after that. But he did choose for his first wife, who died in 1895. Well, they were married in 1875. His first wife was named Jenny Croson. We have a photograph of her. Jenny was dark hair, and she was attractive. This is a painting. But Jenny taught him to read, and it was very interesting to see that she would do it. But she did. She read the scripture for him, and she taught him to read, and she became a very good friend as well as a helper. I want to talk for a minute or two now, though, about the funny parts of his life. We'll come back to some of the more serious things in a minute, but the funny parts of his life. John B. Little has some of the jokes his father told, because things that happened to Jimmy Little he would tell other people about. That's how the stories got out. And his son tells us a story about a man who got baptized, or who almost got baptized, but something intervened. Let's look at John B. Little talking about his daddy.
He was baptized in a pond one day, and one of the men there that he was to baptize had confessed his religion in Christ. He started in, my father was standing out in there, and he said, "Come out a little deeper." And he was tongue-tied. He said, "Preacher, do you need that snake?" He said, "I said, come in a little deeper. I can't understand you." He said, "You need that snake?" He said, "Come just a little deeper." He said, "Preacher Little," he said, "don't you need that warning moccasin?"
I don't know whether that man got baptized or not, but Jimmy Little told the story. He told another story, too, about things happening at home, or he did a funny thing at home. Now, a preacher that goes off and stays months at a time, being an evangelist, working in tent meetings, as Preacher Jimmy did, when he comes home, sometimes there's a little bit of discipline that needs to be done with the children. Here's how he handled one particularly interesting situation. John B. Little speaks.
We were living on the Lawyer's Road at that time. There come this snow and some sleet in the snow. And the older children took his baptizing hip boots out and slid down the bank with them till they wore the seat out. So when they got back to the house, he always whipped the older boys and all with a razor strap. It done a lot of popping, but not so much damage. And he whipped every one of them except me, just give me a little pat on the head. And then he carved on his razor strap, "I need thee every hour."
I need thee every hour, the title of the old hymn. John B., I should tell you, was the baby. He was the youngest of 14 children, and that's the reason he got patted on the head or patted on the back a little bit and didn't get the razor strap. Preacher Jimmy Little in his later years was a man who, when he got on his knees and prayed, you knew something was going to happen. Sometimes, though, funny things happen with respect to this. Here's one person's reaction to Jimmy Little's praying for rain. Again, John B. speaks.
Had an awful dry spell. I believe that was around Marshall, North Carolina. And several of the preachers had met and prayed for the rain. And they asked my father to come and pray for rain. He brought his raincoat and umbrella with him. And I said, Preacher Jimmy, said, there's not a cloud in the sky. He said, if you don't have faith, it won't rain. Said, you must have faith. And they said that he, in his sermon, and he prayed for rain, said it clouded up, and a large rain came up. Said one of the Methodists looked out the window and saw some of the things in his field there floating off. Said, you might know Preacher Jimmy Little would overdo the thing.
Well, now, Baptists like Preacher Jimmy like to pick on Methodists. I don't know who that person was that said that, but I'm sure he did say Preacher Jimmy would overdo the thing, because he did have a sort of concentration, and he would not even know anything was around going on. Matter of fact, his daughter tells us that Preacher Jimmy actually missed the wedding of one of his children. Mattie Moffett tells us the story.
My sister Esther was to be married when we lived on Lawyers Road. And Mr. Carroll, the Baptist minister of the church that we had attended, was to perform the wedding ceremony. And all the house was filled with guests, and she was married in the living room. And my father was sitting in the, what we called the den at that time, talking to Mr. Perry. And they tried to get his attention that the minister was ready to perform the wedding ceremony, but he and Mr. Perry were in a deep discussion about something. So finally I went and told my father that my sister was already married to get up and come on. And that's really the way it was.
Oh, bless his heart. But he did know how to put his attention where the attention needed to go. Another funny thing that he did, and I can't imagine many preachers today doing it, was he bought him a sign and put it on his mode of transportation and would drive it up and down the roads or streets in towns that he would come to, whether he knew anybody or not. Here's what he did. Look at the sign. On the horse it says, "The saloons must go." And he would stand in that buggy and he would yell and he would tell people that the saloons had to go. And sometimes it caused a fight. One final thing I have to tell you is just an image. I don't have a photograph to talk about it, but just an image. Some people told me that one particular man in the Polkton area, who was known for drinking liquor, had spent many happy hours running from Preacher Jimmy Little. He said that the two of them would run so fast, Preacher Jimmy trying to catch this other man, that their coattails would stand out. So the first phase, I guess, of Preacher Jimmy Little's Christian life was one marked by a lot of force. He was a man who could fight. He's a man who would get you saved in spite of yourself.